Hello everyone, Jacob here. In today's lesson, we're going to be talking about this expression, speaking of which. And we use it at the beginning of a sentence like this, speaking of which, and then subject, verb, object. And in Korean, this means 이야기가 나와서 하는 말인데. Alright? And actually, in the last lesson, we talked about something very, very similar. We talked about the expression, that reminds me. That reminds me. That reminds me. And if you haven't watched that lesson, I would go back and just click this link right here and watch that. So speaking of which basically has the same meaning as that reminds me, which, I translated as 그러고 보니까. But I guess speaking of which is used kind of more specifically when you want to start a new topic, of conversation. Okay, so imagine someone says something and kind of that makes you want to start talking about something a little bit different but related. Then you can say, speaking of which, All right, so let's go ahead and look at our first example. So imagine that someone you're talking to, let's call him A, you are B. Someone you're talking to is talking about his new smartphone. He says, I just bought a new smartphone. I got the Galaxy 3S, and it's really cool because it's got a big screen and it has all this great stuff. And I really like the Samsung Galaxy 3S, the Galaxy 3S. And then you kind of start thinking about the iPhone 5, and you can say, speaking of which, when is the iPhone 5 coming out? When is the iPhone 5 coming out? All right, so someone is talking about their Galaxy 3S, and then suddenly you want to start talking about the iPhone 5. Well, you can kind of transition or link to the iPhone 5 by saying this expression, speaking of which, when is the iPhone 5 coming out? All right, so this is a really good way to kind of start a new topic of conversation like that, or just kind of talk about something that's related to what someone just said. But you don't always have to use it like this. You don't always have to say speaking of which. You can just say speaking of 뭐뭐뭐. So let me write that. You could say speaking of, and then you can put a noun plus a noun or an ing verb. Okay, so speaking of smartphones, let me write that. Speaking of smartphones, I really need a new one. I really want to get a new one soon. I have an iPhone 3G. So old and doesn't even work very well anymore. It's really slow and I really need a new smartphone. So, I was talking about smartphones. I gave you that imaginary situation where an imaginary person was talking about their Galaxy 3S, and then the second person kind of just, wanted to talk about the iPhone 5 and said, speaking of which, Anyway, so we talked about smartphones. So I can say, speaking of smartphones, I really need a new one, which is actually true. Or I could say, speaking of buying or getting, new phones. Speaking of buying new phones, I really need a new one. I really need to do that soon. All right. So this speaking of which is used like that. Basically, it's the same as that reminds me, but often used more to start a new topic of conversation. So I guess you could translate this either 이야기가 나와서 하는 말인데, or just 그러고 보니까. Very, very similar expressions. All right. So I hope you enjoyed this lesson. I hope you understood it, and I will see you next time.